and our dream of dreams, this generation that we made the show for, would take to it. And the fact that they seem to have, there seems to have been a resonance is kind of all we can ask for.
Thank you both for being here. Congratulations on Adults. Yeah, of course. I want to start by asking, I read that you began developing Adults after you graduated from Yale in 2018. So I'd love to hear about crafting the story of people who are just out of college while you are just out of college yourself.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, Adults kind of started as wish fulfillment for us. I think both Ben and I moved back home after we graduated, and, there's such a jarring shift in a lot of ways between being in college and having all of this autonomy and creativity and being surrounded by all your friends all the time, and then suddenly you're back home in your parents' house and someone's yelling at you to wash the dishes, and there is just this feeling of like, wait, what were my 20s supposed to be like? And I think in a lot of ways, the dream version of that for us was a version where, sure, I'm in this place that is also kind of synonymous with coziness and care and love, but what if my people were there with me? That really was in some ways where it started from. And then, the more we started to spend time with our friends and sort of hear their stories about navigating post-grad life, be it, bad first jobs or dating, and I think these characters started to sort of jump off the page to us as sort of combinations of the people we love so much.
I love that you mention you having my people around, because the friend group that we see here feels right from the jump so lived in, so relatable, even if you just met these characters. I want to hear, which of the characters was kind of the first one to crystallize for you guys? How did you build out the friend group?
Ooh, what a good question.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it's hard to remember at this point who came first, but I remember our process. We sat down one night and we said, if we were to do this kind of comedy, what are the patterns that we're seeing in our friends? We didn't want to just have a character where we knew one person who felt like an oddball, so to speak, but it's like, we have 3 Antons in our life, and there's something going on right now where this kind of person who's
so dynamic and outgoing and charming and gives so much to everyone, but then sort of like doesn't protect enough of their own peace. Those sort of archetypes that maybe feel a little modern, but at the same time, someone who's 40 years old could be like, oh, I have friends like that.
Totally. So we were like, we got to have someone like Anton in this group. And then we had a friend that was close to Issa, and we were like, what are the patterns that we're seeing in the kind of person who's an activist and has all these causes, but also has like a deep insecurity and she's trying to fight to be serious. So it was a lot about identifying sort of what our friends' experiences were and how they might bounce off of each other.
Yeah, and again, this started in 2018, and now it's 2025, so that's 7 years of development and planning and shooting. And I would love to know, how has, being just an adult, how do you think being an adult has changed from then to then? Because I feel like there's a lot that's different in the world right now.
Oh, it's so true. When we started talking about this, it was before COVID, and I think that luckily we pitched the show with Nick Kroll in 2021. So it was a few years later, and I think one thing that frankly ended up being really helpful was just sort of like staying nimble, continuing to really listen to the people around us, really absorb their stories, frankly, especially with the help of FX, once we got a writer's room together, certainly once we cast these actors, what we realized is like, you can only bring these characters so far when they live on the page, and that extra, the icing, the frosting, but also sort of the heart of who those characters are, that third dimension comes in when you have an actor who says, yeah, my first apartment I had scabies in. Paul Baker talked about that, and Jack Innanen literally did.
No, he did, and he slept on a towel. But a lot of weird coincidences too, where we wrote that and he said, did I tell you that I slept on a towel? And we said no. So sort of just spending enough time and absorbing these actors. It's funny looking back at our original drafts, like I think Amitha, for instance, with Issa, just brought a really fierce smartness to her character, a real intellect that maybe wasn't there on the page. Or certainly Owen informed some of the extroverted tendencies, to say the least, of Anton. And we wrote episode 3 once we started getting to know Owen, which is where he sort of has this capacity to befriend everyone in the world. So exactly, staying nimble, staying adaptive, and listening to our performers.
Yeah, I also think the other thing that has been so interesting about the process has been like back when we were even pitching the show, I think there was an initial instinct to be like, this has to feel grounded in this year, 2021, which is the only year this is ever going to be. You know, like I think you feel that pressure sometimes, especially I think when you're sort of at the outset of sort of like a 20-something show, to be like, how do we make this feel like the most modern thing possible? And I think throughout the process of developing it, one thing that's been so cool is getting to see people of other generations be like, oh yeah, we had all those problems. Yeah. And totally, like the pants shape has changed, but other than that, like the insecurity, the big feelings, the sort of taking your friends being the most important relationships in your lives, all of those things are so consistent. So I think in some ways disavowing ourselves of feeling like we have to represent this year and represent this generation versus being like, this is kind of what our friends sound like, this is how they talk, but you know, hopefully that doesn't mean that only people in this year, in this age will relate to it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I do love that you bring up the generational differences because I do think that this show is fulfilling a hole in programming, like of the hangout comedy for people who are like Gen Z or like Gen Z millennial cusps, that kind of thing. I know that there's been a lot of talk about like comparisons to shows like Friends. So I guess I'd love to hear about fitting into that context, but also trying to, you know, stand out.
Totally.
Such a good question.
It's such a good question. I mean, you know, Ben and I grew up watching Friends. We love that show. We also love Living Single and Seinfeld and Broad City and Girls. And, you know, we do not pretend to be the first people to do a 20somethings living in New York
Are we not?
comedy. I mean, we like perfected it.
Right. Okay.
We reinvented it. It's totally new.
It's brand new to us. But no, just to say that I think those kind of comparisons are both unbelievably flattering. And, you know, before we started shooting the season, we had the opportunity to sit down with Marta Kaufman and David Crane, the Friends creators, and they were unbelievably generous with their time and just had a lot of insight into not just like how you write and sustain a show like this, but also how you build an ensemble and create sort of healthy cast patterns and all of these things that they just did so well. But I will also say, you know, I don't think that, you know, it would be a fool's errand to be like, well, we want to do the next Friends, because what they did so perfectly. And I think all we can aspire to do is sort of do another, like a comedy of young people living together, and the ones that feel true to us is sort of our best case scenario.
Yeah, I will say what's been amazing is hearing people be like, this is a comfort show for me, especially a show like ours, which is so gross, frankly, so much of the time, and so bodily and visceral and cringy, you know, cringe comedy, for people to be like, I, you know, tuck myself into bed and I spend time with my friends. If we can hold both of those things, we will never be any of the shows that you named, you know. But if we could hold both of those things, then I think we made something that we at least are really proud of, and proud of our cast for putting into this world.
For sure. I mean, the comfort thing kind of surprised me because I feel viscerally stressed watching it because I spend a lot of time being like, no, don't do this. Like the whole gun shop interaction in episode 3 is just me going, oh my gosh, like I don't even know what I would do. But I want to come back to David and Marta because I heard that they also had input on changing the title of the show, because I know it used to be Snowflakes and now it's Adults. So can you tell me about the different, like how you went from A to B?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, honestly, you hit on it in part when you said sort of the question of sort of how timely to be. I think that when we pitched the show, we called it Snowflakes as sort of a working title, in part because, you know, people were talking about special snowflakes a lot, and there was this idea of what if we sort of reclaim that, and instead of the point being laughing at these kids and being like, oh haha, they're so sensitive, sort of taking it back and being like, actually they're tougher than they seem, and yeah, in some ways they have these vulnerabilities, but actually they're able to sort of rally together and get the job done. But honestly, as we, you know, started to live more with these characters, and especially in the writer's room, honestly, you know, as we talked about these stories in this time of life, the thing that sort of kept recurring over and over again in our conversations was this question of, you know, it's all about like the study of being an adult and all of the expectations you have of what being a grown-up is going to be like, and the rules of the adult world and how to navigate it, and, you know, how scary and crazy that is. So I think in a lot of ways, you know, that irony of feeling like you're supposed to be an adult, but also never feeling younger and never feeling more out of sorts and having to turn to your friends to sort of buttress your way back up, that question just felt so it felt like it was encompassed by the idea of adults. But also Marta and David were like, are we keeping snowflakes?
And when they say that, you better listen.
And you're like, oh, we got it. Yeah.
It was interesting. It was us sort of looking back in our conversation with them on our experience of watching Friends. And we asked them, we said, you guys, when you were writing this show, didn't feel like you were writing a show about young people, right? And they said, of course we did. It was a study of young people. And, you know, from our perspective, when we were in grade school watching it, it felt like a show about adults. And I think it took that perspective switch to be like, sure, a lot of the people hopefully watching the show will be our age and the age of the characters. Certainly people, you know, we hope are in the generation above or above that, looking back. But we really put ourselves back in the shoes of us watching these shows, feeling like it's not a show about young people, but it's a show about grown-ups. And that's sort of where the adults, as generic a name it is, that's sort of where it came in and felt like it clicked into place.
And Sandler got to grown-ups first, so.
Oh yeah, you know, you can't compete. I love that you mentioned kind of like the milestones of adulthood, because I think there's so many great ones in the show. I want to dig into one in particular, which is the dinner party with the roast chicken, because I have often felt when my friends we're not at dinner party stage yet, but I think a lot of potlucks, and I'm like, at what point should I not bring like a Trader Joe's brownie kind of thing? Like, at what point am I grown up enough to do that? But I want to hear about creating that as an episode, because it's just such a perfect, I think, microcosm of everything you're trying to do.
Oh, that's so kind of you. Thank you. It's one of our favorite episodes. It was written by the brilliant Sanaz Tusi, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning playwright. We are still pinching ourselves that she wrote for our show. But yeah, I mean, I think in the writer's room, one thing we talked a lot about was sort of like, what are, to your point, these metaphors, these symbols of adulthood that you sort of project all of your hopes onto. And I know for myself, one of them was the first time where I was like, I'm gonna cook a grown-up meal. I'm gonna make a roast chicken, which I feel like in some ways, you know, our parents, I feel like, are like, oh, that's easy. Like, you just throw a chicken in the oven. But it's so hard. And I think, you know, getting to explore the metaphor that is, you know, Billy, one of our characters, sort of toiling and trying to put together this perfect meal and trying to present to her older boyfriend this picture of, you know, maturity. And one thing that, just a detail that I always really loved that our set department and our props department did so well is, basically we had a whole meeting about what is Billy cooking. Yes, she's cooking the roast chicken, but what else is she cooking on the menu?
All sides.
And when you said the Trader Joe's brownies, that made me think, you know, we were like, it feels like such a moment in your 20s where you're like, I can't get anything from the grocery store. Like, this is a grown-up meal. So the idea that it was like every single side dish of hers has like 18 different ingredients. She's making green beans, but she's like hand scraping the oranges and the zest and everything. So that all just to say, I think, you know, the idea of the dinner party as this metaphor she has in her head, if she can just nail that, she'll be an adult. And of course it goes so chaotically wrong.
Yeah, it's a pressure cooker of an episode, which is, it's a small but big task to sort of build a pressure cooker around, which is where we found the comedy.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you mentioned him, I have to bring him up, but Charlie Cox as, you know, Mr. Teacher, the adult boyfriend. I mean, you have great guest stars in this show. I mean, Julia Fox also in this episode. Darcy Carden was great to see. John Reynolds, I was like, yay, great. Yeah. Also bring them back, please.
Oh my God, yeah. I would love that.
Because love their dynamic. There's so much cooking there.
Yes.
But yeah, tell me about working with, like bringing, I guess, people who are adults, like in to work with these younger actors, and what is the not generational clash like, but I guess how do they speak to each other as like performers?
Yeah, it's, you know, a great question. I think with Mr. Teacher in particular, to start with Charlie, we wanted, when we were casting that role, to feel like, what if we're watching for 5 episodes, these kids try to come into their own and be mature. What if we dropped a true grown-up into the middle of that, and how would that spin the group out? And when Charlie's name was brought up to us, it was sort of no one better for that part.
Yeah.
He brought it, as you know, in such a way, so much commitment, so much humor. And we said to him, we were like, you have to pull off a magic trick with this role, just to be upfront. You need to be a former teacher, dating your former student, and we have to root for you. We can't be creeped out by it. We sort of, against all odds, need to be like, this might be good for them. This might be long-term even. Yeah. And he did it in a really brilliant way, such that by the time he shows up for episode 6, you're kind of thrown off by the fact that he also has this these inner demons, right? And this inner life that's taken him to ketamine therapy at the worst possible time. So really kudos to Charlie for being able to hold all of that, hold this rom-com arc, frankly, in the middle of our season, and then go, take such an unhinged pivot
Deep,
and blow the
hard
whole thing
comedy.
up.
Yeah.
But that's the Charlie piece. I don't know if there's anything on the other guest stars you want to speak to.
Well, I mean, we just lucked out across the board. I mean, Julia Fox playing herself was just sort of a dream of dreams.
Was the episode written like with her in mind? Did she come in later? Did
It
you know
was.
she had her? Okay,
It
nice.
was. So we knew that we wanted from the jump someone who was going to spiral Issa out. And so we spent a lot of time talking about what is the way that Issa perceives herself, and what is the kind of person who would just be better at all of those things than Issa is at that point in her life. So the idea of this sort of like cool, avant-garde, interesting,
Brilliant.
literary, sort of intellectual, Lower East Side Manhattan icon as this sort of person who is all of the things that Issa thinks she is, and maybe all the roles she occupies within her House of Five Losers.
Certainly, yeah.
But suddenly having sort of the better version of Issa in the space, we knew could be really, really fun. But the idea that Julia agreed to play herself and just showed up not only as such an amazing actor, which we knew she was, but as such a talented improviser. I mean,
gosh.
most of that last scene between her and Issa where she, tells her to go wash her face
And calls her Tina.
was just riffed out by Julia. Yeah, it was really wonderful. So we're just so lucky. And I mean, Darcy Carden, John Reynolds, like just comedy legends, and getting to watch them play off of, that throuple scene with Lucy Freyer, who plays Billy. Watching her really hold her own and the three of them really play off of each other was just so special.
Yeah, that whole sequence was, I mean, I didn't want, for poor John Reynolds' sake, I didn't want to see that whole scene play out, but I was also like, I'm so intrigued to see if this will go anywhere, but also because, I do want to see more of them.
Yeah.
I also want to talk about the location because obviously so many of these great shows are set in New York, Friends, Broad City Girls, all that. And Paul Baker has a line that I love, which is, I think New York can mean a lot of things. So I want to hear about what New York means in this show.
It's a really good question. I think that when we talked about where we wanted to set the show, we always knew we wanted it to be at Samir's parents' house. So I think the first step was figuring out, who is that family and where would they come from? And I think the idea of putting it in Bayside, Queens, which is such a sort of family neighborhood, somewhere that is so sort of, it's not the suburbs, it is staunchly in Queens, but it has this feeling of being so far away from the city, and it is this wonderful, vibrant neighborhood unto itself. It's where both Ben and my moms grew up. But the idea that it's sort of like, oh, it's so close and yet so far from the Sex and the City girls, or even the Broad City girls, or the girls, they're not hitting the town in Manhattan or in Brooklyn. They're not getting invited to the cool clubs or art galleries, with the exception of Billy in that one episode.
Oh, that whole scene. Exactly. It's a nightmare.
Yes, a true nightmare.
Yeah, and we kind of liked the idea that when they venture into those slightly cooler spaces, they're totally unequipped to handle it. So I think that we really wanted to play with sort of the juxtaposition of, this is a family space. This is sort of a cozy place where Billy and Samir grew up, not sort of the cool idealized version of the sort of Manhattan that I think we've seen on a lot of shows.
And I do love how you kind of play with that in the Annabelle episode,
Yeah.
because when she was like, I want pizza and I want to see Wicked, I was like, oh, that's me when I first visited
Oh, of course.
New York.
It's everyone.
But yeah, I mean, that whole plot line dealing with her getting an abortion is, I think, one of several kind of heady topics that you guys deal with. I mean, the whole first episode centers on like the sexual assault. Talk me through approaching these really dark topics with like, a light touch and managing to make it feel funny, because it's a tightrope walk that's really fun to watch, but also like, ooh,
Yeah.
Oh, it absolutely is. And I appreciate that, it worked. I mean, I think that one thing we talked a lot about in the writer's room was sort of making sure that the joke was always on the characters, not on the subjects or, on the movements, certainly. But just really making sure that it was, it's Samir getting in his head about, the way he's treated his partners, or it's Anton and Paul Baker grappling with this girl who is not a metaphor for the pro-choice movement, but rather just the 16-year-old girl who's really difficult and really hard to take care of. So I think the more that we were able to focus on the characters and their very specific reactions to things, the more that I think we were able to let the comedy come from, they're earnestly doing their best, and sometimes they're screwing up, but hopefully you have enough empathy for the characters that you're like, oh, I see how you got there. You shouldn't have done it, but like I see where you were coming from.
And I mean, Ben, you mentioned earlier, this is such like a bodily, like gross show,
Yeah.
and it kicks off with like the subway masturbation showdown,
Yeah.
which already takes things to 100. I'm curious, when you're writing a pilot,
Yeah.
when do you decide like how far are we going to go with what is the first taste of the show for people?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, I think it's a lot of trial and error. It's a lot of writing, relying on your partners, relying on, frankly, Nick Kroll, our executive producer, who threads the needle so beautifully in his work with, to use Big Mouth as an example, they're talking about heavy topics, and yet you feel safe and you feel held by that show. And even if the characters are making the wrong choices, you have a trust over time that the show will land somewhere that's well-meaning and hopefully surprising too. So he was a really incredible guide in so many ways, but in helping us push further or scale back, and like Rebecca said, always make sure we're either punching up or not really punching. Like if you take a step back, it's like, that was sort of the appearance of edginess, but at the same time, it's like we weren't maybe going for it as much as we could have, perhaps. What
Yeah,
do you
the
say?
Annabelle, the abortion episode is a good example. At the end of the day, it's really about Paul Baker and Anton's
Yeah.
relationship, and them essentially co-parenting this kid together. We're watching them realize they're a good team. So I think using sort of hard comedy punches, but as ways to tell stories that hopefully feel quite human. I mean, the other thing I'll say is, one thing we talked a lot about between the two of us was like having the show exist at that level of like, if I was at a party and a friend of a friend was telling this group of people like, oh my God, I did the most embarrassing thing the other day and it was so screwed up. And then they launch into the story and you just have to turn around and be like, wait, I'm sorry, like start from the beginning. What did you do? I think that level of, horror, but empathetic horror was the kind of thing that we wanted to translate in some of these stories.
Yeah, you're like, I need to hear more.
Yes.
Like, yeah, I don't even know you, but like, we have to talk.
Exactly.
That we're gonna laugh about it one day feeling.
Yeah, I love that you also like the Paul Baker Anton storyline, specifically that whole dinner scene where language Annabelle,
Yes.
that is something I have seen come up in a bunch of fan compilations on YouTube, and they all have names just like things from adults that make me laugh, or that kind of thing, like broad, but immediately makes you want to click. And I guess, since this is a show with such online characters, like they're all connected to the internet in some way, what's it been like to see how this show has been received online?
I mean, it's sort of blown us away, honestly. I think in our dream of dreams, this generation that we made the show for would take to it. And the fact that they seem to have, there seems to have been a resonance is kind of all we can ask for.
We're so moved by it. I also think that something that's been surprising to me is how generative the fans have been back. I think not just sort of like tweeting about it or talking about the show, but also creating, like you said, fan edits and fan fiction.
Oh, there's fan fiction already?
There's fan
fiction.
Oh, okay. Well, what is it? I'm assuming Paul Baker and Anton.
Oh,
Yes,
there's a
you
lot of
assume
Paul Baker and
correctly.
Anton.
Oh my gosh.
We were with the cast the other day, and they were jumping into a little bit of it, and very quickly they were like, "Oh my God!" It's
Oh, is it like? I mean, not to out myself as like an AO3 user,
is.
but it's like
Absolutely.
rated E and everything.
It is.
Is it extremely?
Is E for extreme?
E is explicit.
Yes.
It is. It is very.
It's not E for everyone.
No.
It's N for no one, probably.
But no, it's wonderful. And I mean, I think that just the way that people have sort of taken it and created something else with it, we're so moved by the fact that they feel like it's their friends too, because it's supposed to be. And I think, getting to watch them, one thing I've just been loving on, Twitter and TikTok is people calling them my family. The idea that it's like, oh, my family's on TV now. And, that's how we feel about these characters. We've lived with them for so long, and how we feel about the actors, frankly, now, and our production team. And so to get to sort of invite people into that family with us, even through all the cringe and the, raunchiness and whatnot, to have people be like, wow, my family, they screwed up today, but I really like them.
They screwed up. They thought that they killed their therapist,
Yeah.
and which that whole episode was crazy. Sorry, I mean, just I could say that about every episode.
About everyone,
Take it.
Yeah, the Theracide. I'm curious, did the word Theracide come first, or did someone just pitch this and just because how does that happen?
That one came from, we knew we wanted to do an Anton and Issa episode, which is a little bit sort of peek behind the curtains, unromantic, but we were like, this duo is just electric. We want to see them get into trouble and get in over their heads, and especially Anton, who is probably our most in control character.
In many ways, he's the most mature of the bunch.
Yeah. Let's see him get carried away into a sort of more Issa-esque scheme. And we always thought in the room that at least 2 or more members of the house shared a therapist. So when we killed off George, I mean, it was a sad day in the office.
R.I.P. to George.
Yeah, but we wanted to explore.
Shiva alongside,
Yeah, exactly.
alongside the widow.
But we wanted to explore sort of the narcissism of your early 20s and feeling like every story comes back to you and like you are a causal agent. And certainly that's the phase of life that Issa and Anton are in. So Theracide, I think, was pitched out after someone pointed out, like, God, if I was Anton and Issa's therapist, I might end it all. And it's like, and that might be the story.
That's great. Yeah, I love that you speak to how they, like, bringing these different characters together. Was there a character combination this time around that you kind of wish that you had done more with, or that you're excited to explore in more depth in, like, a season 2?
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, I think one that we just had so much fun writing for and watching them play off of each other on set was Samir and Paul Baker. Yes. You know, Jack Innanen and Malik Alassal, they're just so deeply funny together. And, you know, I think off screen as well have this sweet little romance that really translates. I mean, the way that they speak to each other, my favorite little moment is when they are trying to, debating whether to sell alcohol to the minors, because of course they think it's very unethical, but the kids do have a really cool game system, so, you know, it's a toss-up.
They gotta play Smash.
You gotta play Smash. But listening to them debate back and forth and sort of like, they go into these little like, well, we could supervise, we could chaperone. Like
They just all improvised and wonderful, yeah.
They just have such a funny little language they've developed between the two of them. So that's one I'd want to see more of. What about you?
I think one that we didn't get to that I'd be excited about is Issa and Samir. You sort of know, for me, it's like their older brother, younger sister, very clearly, and Issa pests Samir in the pilot about having Paul Baker move in, but we never got to be like, what does their story look like?
Right, because that is one dynamic where Samir is probably the mature one in a lot of ways. So getting to watch him sort of take care of Issa, I think would be something that would be really fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, kind of also on the flip side, what's like an adult milestone that you might have pitched for this season but it didn't quite end up here, and that you're like, oh, I would love to see more of that, or like tackle that in the future?
Oh, it's such a good question. I mean, we have so many. We want to watch these characters grow up for a while. I think one thing that we think a lot about for other seasons is, you know, love lives. I think we got to see little bits of it, and, you know, obviously we end on a big cliffhanger with the promise of a love triangle, but even beyond that, I mean, I think that we want to see them go on more dates, and, you know, to your point about guest stars, we want to see your favorite comedians or, you know, TikTokers or personalities come in and play people for an episode or two, people who ruin their lives or they're madly in love with, or, you know, it goes really well until something doesn't. I think all of that stuff is one area that I just want to see fleshed out for all of them.
Yeah. I'd also say families. It's like, where did these people come from in a lot of ways? And there's only so much that you can do
in 8 episodes.
In 8 episodes. But, you know, Samir's parents aren't going to be gone forever. You know, where are they? We have ideas and we're excited to explore that. But also, like, who were the siblings that helped make these, you know, 5 very specific people into who they are? So that's all stuff that we hope to bring to the fore and have the kids crash into, you know, if we get to go again.
Yeah, the mention of the parents reminds me of that mail scene with, like, oh, they're in Beaver Creek or whatever, and that getting of the mail, that has a kind of like ritualistic feel to it, and there are other rituals like Mind Wipe or House Rules. When you're building a friend group and you're working on like traditions, you know, how do you approach bringing those traditions to life?
Oh, I mean, Mind Wipe is a great example. I think that, you know, one thing we talked a lot about from the beginning is your friend group as this place where you kind of can be your truest self, and the idea that these characters, and I think this generation in a lot of ways, feels a lot of pressure to be good people and to do the right thing.
And think the right thoughts.
Think the right thoughts, all of which is really wonderful. And I think a testament in a lot of ways to, you know, an increased emphasis on being a good person, which is great. But I do also think that, you know, your friend group is where you get to be a little like, can I just say the bad thing for 1 second? Like, can I? And with the understanding that we love each other and it's not because we are bad people, it's because sometimes you need to feel off and like you could just sort of get real. So we were like, we knew we wanted some sort of term for the group being like, I'm going to say a bad thing and I need it to go away afterwards. So mind wipe kind of came out of that.
It's been very fun to see people pick that up even and put it into their lexicon. Or we've seen a few people do house rules with their roommates, which is either very healthy or very unhealthy and going to go poorly. But
depends if they stay roommates after
Have
that.
you seen
exactly.
what are the kinds of rules that they're throwing at their friends?
It's a lot of like, please pick up your shit. And we're like, this is a very creative way and a lot of supplies going into telling your roommate to not be a pig.
It could be also accomplished with the text, but I appreciated the showmanship of the board.
But it's been very fun. I think one of the things that we thought a lot about is like, it's a show that takes place right now. What is the slang? People would ask us sort of like, how much are we incorporating the language of today? And I think our answer is like, let's skirt around that and have them have their own language that will hopefully then catch on, or might not, but at least it will sort of like help the characters feel specific and lived in and evergreen in some capacity. You know, if the world starts talking a little bit more like Anton as opposed to Anton chasing the lingo that is probably outdated by the time we come out, it's not the worst thing, I think.
Totally.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. That's all the time that we have. I really appreciate you guys
thank
coming
you.
in.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
and
Dawn.
congrats again on the show.
Oh my God, thank
Everyone
you
go
for
watch
watching.
Adults.
Yeah.
Please
Watch
do.
Adults on FX and Hulu. But yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you.
so much.
Oh, appreciate
Awesome.
it.